Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to the Rothenberg Hall here at the Huntington at the start of what is the Huntington Centennial celebration. Please join me in wishing the Huntington Library a happy 100th birthday. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here. I look after the fellowship program, the conference program and the lecture program. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here for what is the first of 22 lectures in our centennial series. Some of them inviting back to the Huntington scholars who've worked on the highlights of our collections, and others given by our distinguished fellows in residence, whose one obligation, other than thinking great thoughts in the gardens, is to give a public lecture during their time in San Marino. This evening's talk is given by Professor Jim Walvin, who is the Los Angeles Times Distinguished Fellow in the History and Culture of the Americas, a fellowship which was created in the early days of the Huntington program and has been held by many, many distinguished scholars, including Martha Sanweiss, Woody Holton, Shirley Samuels, David Hall, Fred Hoxie, and Helen Horowitz. It's a particular pleasure, despite the fact that he is a Manchester United fan, to welcome Jim Walvin, who is Professor of History Emeritus at the University of York in England. Jim is, as you'll hear in a moment, one of the world's leading authorities on the history of slavery. He holds his BA in History from the University of Kiel, his Master's from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and his PhD from the University of York. He's held fellowships at the Australian National University, the University of the West Indies in Barbados, at La Trobe University, and at Yale. He's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. And in 2008, he was awarded the OBE, that is the Order of the British Empire, by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for services to scholarship. He is the author of a list of books which is far too long to read here, so I will give you the highlights. Black and White, The Negro and English Society, 1975, which won the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize. Black Ivory, A History of British Slavery. The Quakers, Money and Morals. The Zong, A Massacre, The Law and the End of Slavery, which appeared in 2011. Sugar, The World Corrupted, From Slavery to Obesity in 2018. And most recently, by which I mean last week, Freedom, The Overthrowing of the Slave Empires, 2019. For 20 years, he was either editor or co-editor of the journal Slavery and Abolition. And it's difficult to think of a scholar who has exerted such an influence on a massively significant field such as the history of race and slavery. He's also the person who coined the phrase the people's game to refer to what we sensible people refer to as football. And is a world-acknowledged authority on the history of the greatest game on the planet, even if you are a Manchester United fan. He's in residence at the Huntington this year, working on a project entitled Slavery Matters, Slavery and Modern Society, and it is from that project that tonight's talk is derived. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Los Angeles Times Distinguished Fellow, Professor Jim Walvin.
That's very good. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction. There are a number of thanks I have to make of my own, and that is, first of all, to Steve and his colleagues at the Huntington who've made the transition from North Yorkshire to Pasadena so easy and pleasant. It's been terrific moving here. I also thank the LA Times for its generosity in supporting me for this next year on the fellowship. And I planned really to thank two very close friends who live in Pasadena and who for more than 40 years have actually made me very welcome when I've been in LA, both me and my family. But unfortunately, something happened this evening, they can't make it. They know who they are, and my thanks to them for introducing me to and making me feel at home in this extraordinary city. The title itself, Slavery Matters, I mean, it seems so obvious. It seems such a natural thing now. Slavery's in the air, isn't it? I mean, you can hardly open a national newspaper without being confronted by something about African slavery in the United States. It's kind of dominated political discourse even. It's such a present-day occupation of the media that the title I've chosen seems obvious, kind of mundane in a way. It is so obvious. But what I want you to do is, I'd like to spend this evening persuading you that you need to think about slavery in a very different kind of way, and you ought to think of slavery in ways that you're perhaps not accustomed to in the United States. Think of the way slavery has come to occupy the kind of particular cultural role in the United States. Think of not merely the press coverage of the New York Times, especially recently the 1619 Project. This is the anniversary of the first 20 Africans landing at Jamestown in Virginia. Not merely the New York Times 1619 Project, but much broader, much deeper cultural interest in the subject of slavery, for all kinds of obvious reasons. I mean, novelists have turned to slavery, not just Toni Morrison, of course, but I mean, she's preeminently the one that one thinks of, but any number of major modern American novelists who turn to the subject of slavery as some way of explaining not merely slavery itself, but the extraordinary story of the history of the United States. Think of the movies. Just think of how far we've moved in the way the movies actually project the story of slavery. We've gone from Gone with the Wind, 1939, we've gone from Tara to Tarantino. And you couldn't think of a more extraordinary transition from Gone with the Wind to Django Unchained. And what is it about slavery that's attracted Hollywood in a way that hasn't for a very, very long time? Well, you may think that given this kind of extraordinary discussion with reparations, Democratic candidates seeking nomination, discussing the question of slavery, reparations being discussed at the United Nations, you may think that it's so obviously in the air, we're all agreed that slavery matters. I want you to think that slavery matters in ways that most Americans perhaps don't imagine it to. Not so long ago, slavery didn't matter. Well, it certainly didn't matter to large numbers of historians, and that was particularly true in Europe. I went through, on a recent house move, I went through all my undergraduate and graduate notes that I'd taken. This was between 1960 and 1965. And of all the essays I wrote, of all the lectures I attended, of all the tutorials I sat through and lectures I listened to, not one single word about slavery. I studied, I was well taught, I was taught at a good university, both undergraduate and graduate, and not a single word was mentioned about slavery or the slave trade. Now, something's happened since then. Now, admittedly, it's a very long time ago, 1960 to the present day. It's a very long time ago. So you'd expect things to shift. But what has shifted? What has made the phenomenon of slavery, which was the same in 1960 that it is now, looking back, what brought it to public prominence? I think there are four big issues that transformed the culture of the way we approach the subject of slavery. First of all was it's the seismic changes of the 1960s. First of all was the remarkable impact of the US civil rights movement. I mean, I don't think you can really minimize the impact of that movement on the way people began to think about the past. A parallel to that was the extraordinary emergence of colonial independence right across Africa, Francophone Africa, British Africa, the independence of African states at more or less the same time, and the proliferation of higher education in all of those newly independent African countries and Caribbean countries. Thirdly, there was the beginnings of remarkable migrations of people from Africa into Western Europe, and of course from into North America as well, from the Caribbean. So you have a civil rights movement, you have this extraordinary emergence of colonial independence, the migration of huge numbers of people into Western Europe and North America. But there's also something else that happens amongst historians. There is the rise of a new kind of history. We think of it as social history that has its origins really in France, and that very quickly, well, not so quickly, takes root in the English-speaking world. Social history which actually has the effect of unloosening history's attachment to its old passions of diplomacy, diplomatic and political history, issues began to be studied that have not really been the purview of historians until then. Social history changes all that. So now this is a very brief thumbnail sketch. Civil rights, migrations, colonial independence, the impact of social history. All of these are thumbnail sketch of really much broader, much deeper changes that actually affect the way we think about slavery. But the effect it had was it shifted the study of slavery from the margins to the center. Slavery moved in the course of the 60s and then into the 70s to the center of interesting discussion amongst academic historians. So let's all agree that slavery matters. We're all agreed on that, just for the sake of argument. But not in the way that many people might think it is. Let's begin with some evidence. What I want to do, and there's a subsidiary theme to what I want to talk about tonight, and that is the nature and the question of historical evidence. How do historians dig up the past? How do they write about it? How do they excavate material and interpret it for themselves and for other people reading it? The extraordinary thing about slavery is that we know more about it than about almost any other comparable group of people. Africans seized in Africa, put on board the Atlantic slave ships, shipped into the Americas, worked, and throughout their working days, were treated as things. They're objects, they're chattel, they're items of trade. They have a value, they're given, they're bequeathed, they're inherited, they're bought, and they're sold. They are items of property. And as property, of course, they enter the documentation. We have huge volumes of written and printed material about slaves because the slaves were treated as chattel. Now that raises a very interesting question. If it's true that we have so much information about them, how was it that historians didn't notice it for so long and really only turned to it in the last few decades? Why was it left to a kind of marginal role? Well, let's begin at an obvious place. Let's begin at Jamestown. This is some data that's inspired really by Jamestown, by the 1619 project. 20 Africans land in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. But by then, there are 186,000 Africans already in Brazil, and there's more than 1/3 Africans in Spanish America. So the question you ask yourself is, what's so significant about the 20 that land in Jamestown? If you roll the story forward a generation to the mid-17th century, to 1650, there are about 100 Africans in North America, mainly in the Chesapeake. There are 433,000 in Spanish America, 1/3 in Brazil. Now, that raises some very, very interesting questions about what we mean about slavery, about the slave trade. Now, another point to be made is that when we're analyzing these statistics, it's pretty clear now that until the 1820s, there are many more Africans settled in the Americas than Europeans. I'm not talking about North America here, I'm talking about the whole hemisphere. There are more Africans land in the Americas in the years before 1820 than Europeans. And indeed, one of the most eminent historians of the slave trade has argued that until 1820, the Americas are much more an outpost of Africa than they are of Europe. Now, that actually just turns round our image that we have, really, of the people who settled the Americas. The pioneering settlers for key areas of the Americas is not the European, but the African. And I'll return to this time and again. What makes all this possible is, of course, the Atlantic slave trade. That quite extraordinary movement of millions of Africans across the Atlantic, the enforced movement of Africans on the slave ships, which has become such a kind of popular image in the public mind of the pestilential ships and the extraordinary casualty rates on board those ships. I think it is that slave trade and the slave ships that make these figures possible. But one problem in really understanding the enormity of what takes place is that historians have tended to concentrate primarily on the English-speaking world until very recently. It's the English-speaking world that has dictated the studies of the slave trade and of slavery in the Americas. And I think this over-concentration on the English-speaking world has led to a kind of a genuine misunderstanding of what slavery, of the importance of slavery in Western history. And I count myself as one of the people who contributed to this. It's only now that we're beginning to get behind the statistics, for instance, these figures, and think seriously about, and there are people in the audience working on this, think seriously about the impact of Spain and Portugal in the development of the slave empires, the African slave empires of the Americas. Now, if we do get beyond this, and we look at the statistics, there is a problem that historians have tended really to think of the figures, the numbers, as the story itself. And I'm very keen to sort of stress that the concentration on the numbers provides you only with a kind of skeletal framework for a much broader social understanding of slavery and the slave trade. However, that's not to say that the statistics don't matter. They're absolutely vital. Getting the figures right is absolutely imperative. If you don't get the figures right, then your guess is as good as mine. What matters is to get them right. But what also matters is not to imagine that the figures alone tell you the entire story of African slavery in the Americas. It doesn't. The figures are the kind of skeleton around which we need to build a fuller body of understanding of slavery. One of the other difficulties of understanding slavery is that the evidence is extraordinarily confusing and very, very conflicting, particularly for modern students, particularly for younger students. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. Now, this is something that everyone in the audience will be familiar with. I actually thought of playing it. It is a kind of almost a second national anthem, isn't it, in this country? John Newton's Amazing Grace, written in 1779, the Olney hymns. The music that we're all familiar with is actually American music from the 19th century, but the words of this hymn, most people in this room would know familiar, could sing it easily. John Newton, English abolitionist, devout preacher, late 18th century, one of the great contributors to the first early campaign against the slave trade. But look at something else he wrote. Run back the spool 20-odd years. This is John Newton, writing in 1751 and 1752. Look at the second one. By the favor of divine providence, made a timely discovery, the slaves were forming a plot for insurrection. Put the boys in irons and slightly in the thumbscrews to urge them to a full confession. Same man, different kind of talk, different kind of writing. This is John Newton, the slave captain, on board 2 slave ships out of Liverpool, heading for the Caribbean with a cargo of African slaves. How do you deal with this extraordinary conflict, apparent conflict, of Newton the abolitionist and Newton the slave trader? There's another instance that I could have reproduced here. Is at one point, John Newton docks at Sandy Point in St. Kitts, and he docks next to another English slave ship from Wapping in London, captained by a man called Alexander Cluny. Cluny was a kind of amateur theologian, captain of a slave ship, amateur theologian. And for 2 or 3 nights, John Newton and Alexander Cluny sat side by side on the decks of their slave ships, discussing theology, as their crew fumigated the slaveholds from the recently departed African slaves. They were cleaning out the stink of the slaveholds. And these 2 men at the very time were talking about theology and how you secured grace. How does a man manage to get grace, and how do you get to heaven? And these 2 men thought nothing didn't see any kind of conflict or contradiction between their discussions about theology and this godless world that we'd all think of now of slave trading and shipping Africans into the Americas. And that kind of conflict is something which young students find very, very hard to deal with. But of course, you don't have to go back to the 18th century to see that kind of apparent conflict. I mean, anyone who's familiar with 20th century European history will see it immediately, that we have any number of examples of sophisticated, well-educated Germans of sensibility spending the days killing Jews in the forests of eastern Poland and listening to Mozart and reading Goethe and weeping in the evening. That kind of conflict between sophistication and brute crudity is not peculiar to the slave ships, but it does make it very difficult to deal with when you're teaching it. It's a very, very difficult problem. Another factor about the evidence about slavery is it sometimes comes to you in very different forms, indirectly. It kind of creeps upon you, or it lurks in the background in ways that you don't imagine. Now, this is a picture. This is the place I grew up in. This is a part of North Manchester in England. This is a little town called Failsworth. And the house I was born in is actually right in the middle of that. And that big factory here, the Gladstone Mill, is where I had my first job when I was 15. And the church next to the steeple there, St. John's Church, that's where I was the head choir boy, by the way. I mean, it's a pretty grim scene, isn't it? You know, but look at the skyline. It's a skyline that's dominated by factory chimneys. And of course, those factory chimneys are textile factories. And that takes us into the direct link to slavery. Look at this. This is the coat of arms of the city of Manchester, in my hometown, incorporated as a city in 1842. Remember, Manchester is the shock city of the Industrial Revolution, the place that Marx and Engels live in and work in. Engels lives there. They write about the city that represents all that's terrible, really, about the early Industrial Revolution. But what's interesting about this coat of arms is that it's in individual elements. If you look at the B at the top there, right at the very bottom, if I can work this, the B is up there somewhere, right at the very top of the globe. Well, the B is the B was on the badge of my school uniform when I was a teenager. The B represents industry, you know, busy as a bee. So you can see where that came from. But what about the sailing ship? Why would Manchester is a landlocked city? It's 30, 40 miles from the sea. The nearest place is Liverpool. I mean, why would you have a sailing ship represent the city of Manchester? Well, in some ways it's pretty obvious, and that is that it's trade, it's international trade. It represents Manchester's link to the wider world. But what was that link? What did that link consist of? It consisted, of course, of cotton in and textiles out. And where did the cotton come from? Of course, it came from here. Much of the cotton in the Lancashire textile industry until the 1860s comes from the south, and it's shipped through New Orleans, and it's shipped through Mobile, often via New York, to Liverpool, to the great city of Liverpool. And I said this not simply out of deference to Steve Hindle, but the great city of Liverpool, which in the 18th century, remember, is England's great slaving port. In the mid to late 18th century, 1 African in 5 crosses ships in the North Atlantic on ships from Liverpool. But by the time we're looking at here, the textile revolution, Liverpool has become something else. It's become a different kind of port. It's importing huge volumes of cotton for the Lancashire textile industry and exporting finished textile goods to the wider world. But that cotton was grown by slaves in the American South in the Great Delta expansion of the early 19th century. Now, as a schoolboy, in that particular world I was talking about, those factory chimneys, as a schoolboy, I used to prowl the streets of Manchester and the area around it, really interested in the world I grew up in. I'm sort of like most sort of bright kids interested in history. I want to try to explain this quite extraordinary, really rather filthy kind of world that I grew up in. But the penny never dropped. The penny didn't drop that actually I was surrounded by evidence about slavery, about the connection between the world I grew up in and the world of slavery. But of course, I wasn't the only one. I mean, there were very few historians in Britain in the period I was talking about, 1950s and early 60s, who really latched on to the significance of slavery in the creation of modern Britain. And well, why was that so? Why were historians so slow on the uptake? British historians in this particular case. I think one of the factors is there's a kind of tyranny of distance. That concept is something which an Australian historian has devised, and very effectively for understanding Australian history. But this extraordinary distance that separated the British and Europeans in general from the world of Atlantic slavery. It was very easy for the British in the 20th century, the British historians reconstructing their past, to think of slavery that was something to do with Africa. It was something to do with the high seas, something to do with the Americas, as if the British were detached and isolated from that whole process. So that slavery was out of sight and out of mind. It was over there. But that was true not just of the British, it was true of most of continental Europe. The very people whose maritime powers and navies actually perfected the slave system of the Americas put that geographical distance between themselves and what they had done. And yet slavery is there all around you. If you walk the streets of the major port cities of Europe, slavery is everywhere around. If you look at the ports from Newport, Rhode Island down to Rio, if you go from Liverpool to Bordeaux, there's evidence for slavery everywhere. You can see it in merchants' buildings, merchants' houses. You see it in street names, Virginia Street, Jamaica Street in Glasgow. You see it in the surviving sugar refineries of the great port cities. It's in the warehouses, for instance, of Bordeaux, where the warehouses have African faces carved above the entrances to the warehouse. You can see it in the chateaux of planters that settle in the hinterland of Bordeaux, who'd made their money shipping Africans to Guadeloupe, Martinique, and especially to Saint-Domingue, the place that becomes Haiti. The evidence is there. It's just not literary evidence. It's not written evidence. It's material things. It's material culture. And I think one of the problems is that historians have been very slow to come around to incorporate other forms of evidence that's not literary and not printed into their research and into their narrative. But if you walk the streets of the great port cities of Western Europe, the evidence is there for you to see. It's also there in very, what look at first sight to be kind of esoteric, odd ways. I mean, who would think that this takes you into the world of slavery? These very beautiful cowrie shells, a very fashionable item, particularly amongst African American women, but women the world over. These lovely cowries that necklaces, bracelets, bangles, items on clothing, in the hair. What's that got to do with slavery? Well, the cowrie shell becomes one of the great means by which the Europeans buy Africans into West Africa as slaves. Zillions of barrels and sacks of cowries are shipped into West Africa by European slave traders, where, along with other commodities, they're exchanged for African slaves. It may seem a very esoteric topic, but actually it takes you to a much broader subject. In the 17th and 18th century, millions of sacks of cowrie shells are shipped from the Maldive Islands, which is where the best ones come from, to India, then to the European ports, and back to West Africa, where they're exchanged for African slaves. Now think of this for a minute. You've got a cowrie shell from the middle of the Indian Ocean, shipped to India, transshipped to Rotterdam, London, wherever, then transshipped to West Africa, where it becomes part of the local economy in the exchange for African slaves. This is a quite extraordinary global trade. It's not just a trade in the Atlantic. Now, cowries have been used in long-distance trade for centuries. It was a common medium of exchange in Arabia. It was used in India. It was used in China. But the slave trade actually lifts the whole thing to a totally different level. It's thought that the cowries not only travel 16,000 miles before they reach West Africa, but between 1700 and 1790, something like 10 billion shells are shipped into West Africa. 10 billion, I mean, huge volumes. There's a very detailed study of this, and you could check on this if you really wanted to. And there, of course, in West Africa, not only was it they were exchanged along with other imported commodities for African slaves, but they enter local usage. And if you want confirmation of that, here's one. This is a contemporary Ghanaian coin with the cowrie shell on it. And people have divorced the cowrie shell from its historical past. Who thinks today of that beautiful necklace and the modern Ghanaian coin and think that this had anything to do with slavery? And yet it was basic to the slave trade. If you go to the library, just around the corner, there is a portrait, a sketch on the wall as you walk along one of the sides, which includes this. This, of course, is the most famous plan of a slave ship. This is the Brooks, a sailing ship out of Liverpool. The original picture was drafted by Quakers in Plymouth in England in 1787, in that first great phase of abolitionists, the campaign against the slave trade. that was pioneered and led by the Quakers, who come to exercise an influence out of all proportion to their numbers. The Quakers launched this particular image. Now, this image is actually repeated and in any number of forms. You see it on dust jackets, you see it in illustrations, the crowded sardine-like conditions of those slaves. It seems absolutely straightforward and simple in its crude brutality. But even this, as historical evidence, can mislead you. It can mislead you in ways that are very hard to imagine, first of all. What happened is that that ship traveled something like, it did 11 journeys, and it carried something like 5,000 African slaves, 5,100 Africans across the Atlantic in the course of its sailing career. About 4,500 survive. But on one voyage, it carried 288 more Africans than you see in this picture. Now that gives you some sense of the extraordinary nature of a slave ship filled. Remember, you could smell a slave ship 5 to 7 miles downwind if you were chasing it. You get some sense of it. I mean, you can get slightly pornographic talking about this, and I don't want to. But think of this, that ship with 288 more Africans on board. And that raises a simple question. How do you control those slaves? On one voyage, the Brooks, this particular ship, had a crew of 38 men in charge of 432 Africans, right? On another voyage, it had 45 crewmen and 609 Africans. Now, that raises some very interesting questions about how did the slave ships survive? Remember that rebellion on the slave ships is commonplace. We know that one slave ship in 10 of the many thousands that cross the Atlantic, one slave ship in 10 has some form of slave rebellion on board. And of course, the way of maintaining security is firepower and chains. Now, this is an image which is deeply unpopular for all kinds of modern reasons, and you can understand why. This is something that particularly African Americans, African Caribbean people don't like, and you cannot see why that is the case. But I think you've got to rethink the story of slaves and chains and slave ships. Because without the chains, there would have been no slave trade. I think what we need to think of is that the chains of slavery, the chains of the slave ships, speak not to African defeat, but to African defiance. Without these chains, there would have been no slave trade. One slave ship in 10. Every slave ship that left its port, whether it was leaving Liverpool or whether it was leaving Rio or Salvador in Brazil, they knew that they had to have chains on board to control the Africans. There was no way of actually shipping such huge numbers of people without some kind of manacle to hold them in place. Slave defiance is what lurks behind the chains, not slave defeat. Now, as I said, the Brooks is only one of tens of thousands of slave ships crisscrossing the Atlantic. This gives you some sense of the phenomenon as a whole, the Atlantic slave trade. Now, you can go on the web and you find any number of pictures. This is a particularly graphic one and a good one for my purposes anyway. If you look at those flows of people, and remember we're talking about something like 12 plus million Africans loaded onto the slave ships, and something in the region of 11 plus million who survived to landfall in the Americas. What these rough outlines of arrows give you is a sense of the volume of Africans going to particular places. And for North Americans, it comes as a very great surprise to find that only a small stream, a relatively small stream, goes to what becomes the United States. There are some very curious factors behind this flow of Africans across the Atlantic, this enforced flow. The great bulk of the Africans shipped across the Atlantic are going to two places, and you can see this very clearly, to the Caribbean and particularly to Brazil. And the reason that they're going to those two places in particular is overwhelmingly that the great bulk of the Africans landed there are going initially to work in sugar. Sugar is the great engine that drives the slave trade for great geographical reaches of its story. Brazil and the Caribbean is sugar. Now, that's not the only thing that slaves do in those regions, obviously, but nonetheless, it's sugar that is the great devourer of Africans from the slave ship. And it's at that point, of course, that we come to the extraordinary impact of slavery on the way we live and the way we lived from the 17th century onwards. And where, again, the evidence is in front of us. Wherever you want to go, you find evidence for it. But it's there in plain sight, but hiding. I mean, what has this got to do with slavery? Well, this is a very beautiful sugar bowl, and it's from the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's a piece of Sèvres porcelain. By then, 1760s, the Europeans had cracked the ability to make porcelain the way the Chinese have been doing it for hundreds of years. These very beautiful artifacts are in every museum and gallery, including one just a few hundred yards from here. Very beautiful objects in themselves. But who looks at that and thinks, this actually tells us something about slavery? Because that French sugar pot would be filled with sugar that was cultivated by Africans in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, and particularly in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, the French colony that explodes in 1791 and becomes Haiti in 1804, and for which the French, by the way, levied huge punitive damages on the new state of Haiti, which were not paid off until the 1920s, which leads us to all kinds of questions about reparations. But who would look at that and similar and think, this tells you something about slavery? Well, it does. It tells you about consumption of sugar. What does this gentleman tell us anything about slavery? Well, this is Louis XIV, the Sun King. This particular portrait, there are variants of this by Rigaud in 1701. There are variants of this. This one hangs in the Getty. Now, he's every inch a king, isn't he? He's this regal presence, his wonderful head of hair, his military posture. In fact, he's as bald as a billiard ball. He has no hair. He's only 5'4". Well, there's nothing wrong with that. This is not the only one who's 5. He's only 5'4", but he's not smiling. And he's not smiling because he has no teeth. And he has no teeth because, like Elizabeth I, a century earlier, he loved his sugar. It was said at the time that Frenchmen loved their sugar so much that they had so much in their coffee you could stand the teaspoon up in it without it falling over. He loved his sugar and he had no teeth. And there's a very good book on this by a man called Colin Jones called The Smile Revolution. I think he misses a few tricks in that book, but what he does is to say, and it is I'm not an art historian, but he said that, you know, the 18th century portraiture, it was very unfashionable to portray nobles and aristocrats and royals smiling, because smiling and laughing was a kind of a vulgar exercise. Only the common people did that. Of course, the real reason he didn't want to smile, because he's got no teeth. And he's got no teeth because he consumes vast amounts of sugar. Next time you go to the Getty and see that, think of his teeth and think of sugar. And where, you might ask, is slavery here? This is a 40-minute drive from where I live in North Yorkshire. It's Harwood House. This absolutely magnificent, stately home. They began building it in 1759. It's got a wonderful art collection. It has Chippendale furniture that was made by Chippendale in the grounds, in the house itself. It has gardens by Capability Brown. It's a simply magnificent place. What's it got to do with slavery? Well, it's got everything to do with slavery. In 1833, when the British abolished the slave system, abolished slavery, not the slave trade, in 1833, British Parliament set aside £20 million, brokered by the Rothschilds, to be distributed per capita to slave owners. The Harwoods of Harwood House received £23,000 for the 1,200 slaves that they owned on their properties in Barbados and Jamaica. They were slave owners. They were plantation owners. But in fact, a century before, they were just small farmers in North Yorkshire. And the transition from being small farmers to owning this pad in North Yorkshire is an interesting one. They were merchants, they were traders, they had government licenses, which meant skimming off the top. They lend money, and when planters couldn't pay them back, they took over their plantations, and they become major plantation owners and sugar manufacturers. But again, who would go to this place and think it's got anything to do with slavery? Now, in fairness to the Harwoods now, they've come clean about this, like as have so many other places in the United States. You know, when I first went to Monticello in the 70s, I mean, you didn't talk about slavery. Sally Hemings was something that you would be booed out of the house for saying it. But now, many of these places have come absolutely clean about slavery, and slavery is up front. It's true also at Harwood House. There are big projects going on in the UK at the moment on the relationship between slavery and stately homes, because people admire the homes, the grounds, the furnishings, etc., but forget what made it all possible. In this case, it's sugar and it's slavery. But who looks at that and thinks of this? Now, this is a picture from 1823 from a man called Clark in, this is Antigua. These are the people who make this possible. This first gang, the heavy gang, cutting cane, sugar cane in Antigua, 1823. You could spend a long time looking at this picture and analysing it. If you look at it, half the field gang there are women. When I first wrote about this, we always said, oh, they use the healthy young men to cut the cane. That's the hard brute work. But in fact, we now know that 50% of the people in the field gangs were women. Just see the picture. There they are. Not only that, but these are slaves who are all wielding machetes, right? They're all wielding machetes. On the sugar plantation that I worked on in Jamaica in my first book, there were 500 Africans and their descendants and 10 white men. At harvest time, those 10 white men physically could not control all those slaves who were equipped with agricultural tools that they could have overwhelmed the white leadership. So that raises all kinds of interesting questions about how is slavery maintained in the teeth of this extraordinary numerical discrepancy and the fact that large numbers of slaves have materials that could actually be used as weaponry. Not merely does looking at Harwood House raise a question about how do you make it the link between slavery, but when you go inside it, you have the same question. I mean, you go into Harwood House and you'll come across this. This is the state dining room. This is Chippendale, the state banqueting room. All that furniture was built in the house. Before I collected these pictures together for this lecture, I did this before I left Yorkshire. I didn't realize, I hadn't thought, because if you could walk a few yards from here to Henry Huntington's dining room, and there indeed is an 18th century mahogany dining table. Not as elaborate as that, but nonetheless, the point is still the same. Who would look at that and think it's got anything to do with slavery? Well, that mahogany is cut by African slaves, and they're cutting it in Cuba, in Jamaica, and on the Mosquito Coast, Belize, Honduras. But who would look at that and think it's got that table of that furniture got anything to do with slavery? But the logging gangs were all enslaved gangs. Now, if you wander around the museums and galleries of this country, you'll see mahogany furniture left, right, and centre. I first came across it when I was working on in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. They had an extraordinary cornucopia of wonderful items. Down every corridor, there seemed to become a piece of mahogany furniture. Why are North Americans importing timber in the 18th century? I mean, this place is groaning with timber, New England. But there's something special about mahogany, and it starts by a change of an English Act of Parliament in 1821. And it becomes this quite extraordinary craftsmanship in building high-class, high-end furniture for prosperous people. If you go to museums in this country, any number of items of mahogany furniture. If you go to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, we lived there, I worked there, I asked them to look in the warehouse. The warehouse is packed, floor to ceiling, with mahogany furniture, 18th century mahogany furniture. And when prosperous people die in Virginia, they leave it to Colonial Williamsburg, and they don't know what to do with all this furniture. It's piled high in the warehouse. But who thinks that has got anything to do with this? Now, because the logging gangs of slaves are deep in the jungles of Jamaica, Cuba, and Brazil, we don't see them. They're out of sight, out of mind. And this is a sketch from the 1820s. It's a poor sketch, but it gives you some sense of the extraordinary difficult work that the slaves in the jungle clearings faced in moving mahogany trees that they'd logged down and moving it to the waterway to sail it down to the ships waiting to take it to North America and to Europe. Well, this is all about evidence. This is all about the relationship between items all around us that take us directly or indirectly to the story of slavery. But it's pretty clear to everyone now, isn't it, that by the late 18th century, by, let's say, on the eve of American independence, slavery is everywhere in the Western world, everywhere. It's not merely in the North American colonies. It's the vital force that makes possible the development of the Caribbean. It's this huge human engine that makes Brazil into this quite extraordinary economy that it is. But it spreads right across to Europe as well. Black servants stroke slaves, and that raises all kinds of legal, social questions that emerge in the 17th and 18th century. Commonplace in 17th and 18th century portraits. We're so familiar with these that we don't even notice them. This is one of Hogarth's great paintings. Again, a black servant. Britain is groaning with poor people who would like to be servants, trained up as servants. You don't need to import people from Jamaica or from Virginia to be a servant. But it happens. It happens because employing black people as servants and slaves becomes a fashionable item. The royals do it, aristocratic people do it, prosperous people do it. Slaves are everywhere. Slaves were actually amongst the first people, black people and Africans and slaves, the first people on naval ships to go to the Arctic on a Royal Naval Expedition. There are slaves and ex-slaves, freed blacks, on the first Botany Bay ships that take the settlers to Botany Bay, Sydney, Australia, in 1787. There are Africans and their descendants clean round the world. But of course, the great concentration of them, the ones that we're all familiar with, are the concentrations on the plantations that produce sugar and rum in the Caribbean and Brazil, sugar and coffee in Brazil particularly, tobacco, then cotton in the United States, sugar and tobacco in Cuba. The great concentrations of Africans are there, and it's there that we need to begin to look, really, to get a different kind of view of what slavery is. It's not just, as I say, the 19th century, not just slavery in North America. Now, all of this made possible by the Atlantic slave trade. But the British and the Americans end their Atlantic slave trade 1807, 1808. That seems to be the end of the story of disruption, but it isn't. There are huge slave trades that take place inside the United States and inside Brazil in the 19th century, moving huge numbers of Africans to other locations. The United States no longer needs imported Africans. They have a vibrant, growing black population in the old states, back north and east. And those people are uprooted and moved down to the delta to produce cotton. In Brazil, the similar pattern happens. Huge numbers of Africans are shipped from old slave regions down to the new coffee regions. We now know that over 1 million Africans are moved along an internal slave route inside Brazil in the 19th century. Almost 1 million Africans moved inside the United States. One slave family in 3 is broken up in the 19th century in the USA. Any number of children uprooted from their family because of this internal slave trade. And it is a quite extraordinary phenomenon. If you link the Atlantic slave trade to these internal slave trade, what it takes you to is the story of disruption and dislocation amongst Africans clean across the Americas. Let me try and bring things to a close by a different kind of evidence. This is an advert, the Times Dispatch, 1904, Richmond, Virginia. Just read it. David Easton, colored, Roxabelle, North Carolina, writes to the mayor asking about his brother, who was sold several years before the war, Civil War. This is 1904. Look at this one. It's a bit murky. Now you'd have to have a heart of stone not to feel moved by this. I was sold in Richmond, Virginia. This is 1907. Right? This is Fanny Strong trying to find her lost family. This isn't something from the Dark Ages. This isn't medieval. This is something, we're actually within human touching memory distance of this. My own grandfather, was a young man when this appeared in the newspaper. You know, it's that close to us. These are the cries of very old former slaves, of African Americans in deep old age, seeking out lost relatives that had been cast to the four winds by the system of slavery and by the Civil War. It's not just this that actually disrupts African life and scatters people in their millions to the four corners of the earth. It's the systems that take place in the hemisphere itself. Great slave trades, great movement of people. Dislocation, uncertainty is the recurring theme of life for African Americans in slavery and afterwards. What I've done, I hope, is to display in front of you different kinds of evidence that's ranged from industrial England through to 19th century adverts, from fashionable taste in sugar, fashionable taste in of slave-grown commodities that are with us to this day, whether it's smoking or sweet drinks or sweet foodstuffs. What I've offered you is an array of evidence that suggests that you really only understand slavery if you move beyond some of the most obvious forms of evidence, but equally, and most important of all, you really only understand the full significance of the contribution of Africans and their offspring to the Americas if you move beyond the story of the United States itself. I'm not saying you should forget that or ignore it, far from it, but it has to be incorporated into the wider hemispheric story of what happened to millions of Americans. And if you do that, you will get a more nuanced, wider picture. I don't know what else I have to say to persuade you that slavery matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So we have time for questions. Our experience in this room is that if you shout your question out, you can be heard, but we'll make sure we repeat it if there is any doubt. Are there any questions? This lady here.
I know you're a historian, but I'm really interested in your opinion of reparations.
The reparations
Yes.
question.
You know, 10 years ago, that question never came up. Now it's the first question at every time. Because it does depend what you mean by reparations. If it's a check that's going to be signed, that's not going to work. No, I don't think any Western country, any Western government is going to actually sign checks like that. But, I mean, if you remember the contribution that slaves made to the economic well-being of the Western world, including the United States, including Western Europe, it does raise that, and the problems that survive actually amongst the communities that emerged from slaves. There is room for saying, listen, there are things that can be done that actually go some way to rectifying the injustices of the past. There are things that the British can do in the Caribbean, for instance, in providing health facilities and education or whatever it is, and equally in Africa. But the trouble is, it's so snarled up with the idea of a simple check and money that I think that's deceived us. But my own view of this, again, is that the first step in all this is getting our history right, is understanding what actually happened. Now, no, you're not going to get unanimity on this ever, because history is a broad church and people argue left, right, and centre. But nonetheless, I think we do have to, I think the British in particular have got to come clean about this. The British have been very reluctant to think of themselves as slave trading people, despite the fact that they were the great slave shippers of the North Atlantic. And it's come as a tremendous revelation to large numbers of British people that slavery was what made us what we are in many ways. So I think that's one of the first steps.
I understand that large amounts of Africans were taken to Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries, and that their lifespan was even shorter because of the harsh mining work that they were required to do. Can you comment on that?
Yes, well, we could spend another hour talking about the Indian Ocean slave trade. If you look at this map, there are slave movements of Africans across the Sahara. We know that took place over a millennium. It's a huge migration of Africans to the Mediterranean and to North Africa, right? So there's that. There's this extraordinary migration here, the big thick thing, to India and Asia. There are huge numbers of Africans go shipped to Asia as slaves, and also to India. Now, quite why the mortality rate should be worse in one place rather than another. I think what that raises is the fact that certain kinds of work are more demanding and more crippling than others. It's much tougher working in sugar than it is working in tobacco, say, in the same way that it's much harder being a coal miner than being a university professor. You know, it's that kind of difference. That it's the nature of the work that people do that provides the kind of huge differences in demographic and life expectancy among slaves. So now whether that's true, that it is worse in Arabian countries, I simply don't know. But I think it's the nature of the work that will give the answer to that.
One of the things that is hidden about why slavery was so successful is resistance to malaria. People who have sickle cell trait are not ill, but if the malaria parasite gets into the red blood cell, that red blood cell in an individual with sickle cell trait will sickle, and the malaria parasite will die.
Right.
And that person can work very hard in areas where malaria is endemic.
Right.
And if you look at the map, malaria was endemic in all of South America, the Caribbean, and all the way up to the Mason-Dixon line.
Right.
It's above the Mason-Dixon line that the advantage of African resistance to malaria and the sickle cell trait
Right.
disappeared.
What you've done is raise something that historians have become really interested in, that is the whole epidemiology of this story. That the story of disease and why some people resist and some people don't. I mean, why not cultivate sugarcane in West Africa? Think of it for a minute. Why move Africans 3,000-4,000 miles to grow sugar in the Caribbean or Brazil when you could grow it in tropical Africa? Well, because the reason is that the white men doesn't survive in West Africa. And the white presence in West Africa is very, very dangerous until the mid-19th century onwards and the emergence of modern tropical medicine. So I think the story of which diseases inhibit the settlement and work of one group rather than another is important. I mean, why, for instance, are there tremendous inroads of collapses of populations amongst native Indian peoples in the Americas with the coming of the white man? You know, that takes you to this broader question of epidemiology. And what you say is just part of a broader picture of who is immune to certain kinds of problems physically.
Hi there, go ahead.
I hope this makes sense, but now that you said epidemiology, I'm just wondering, because you have such a history of studying this field for so long, if this may be beyond your purview, but is there a movement towards, I mean, millions of people live this, they don't have to be told about it, like a lot of us do, they don't have to have their eyes open to it. Is there a movement to actually listening to them and legitimizing their experiences as opposed to the academy having to come to it through scholarship, or us having to say, now we know about this, so it happened? I know that might be beyond you, but I just wonder even if you've seen a move towards that, or if that exists in would you please repeat that?
I'm not sure.
So I think the question is really about whether the African American population needs to be taught this because they know it specifically from their own.
I think one of the interesting answers in a roundabout way to what you're talking about is that this is not simply a story that, say, African Americans need to know about or do already know about. But clearly, that evidence of those letters, the family is still around, and they know this. This is part of folk culture. You know that you don't have to go to the archives for that. But what is really important is it's the folks who don't know that, and the folks who don't know that tend to be white folks. You know, I'm not saying that I'm simply writing books and doing research for white people or for white Brits or whatever. But this is a story that is actually for everybody. Some people know a great deal about it. Some people know nothing about it. And some people are totally resistant to it, you know, in the same way that they believe in the Flat Earth Society. You know, there's some people, it doesn't matter what you say, they just won't believe it. And that's the way things are. But the real drive for understanding slavery is that it's a story that is about all of us, what made us the kind of societies we were in the 17th, 18th century, and the kind of places that we became, right down to the present day. That sounds slightly pious, and I don't mean it to be, but I think it's true.
We'll take a
That's an interesting question, actually. Were the slaves making these requests literate? Well, of course, it'd be wrong to think that they're illiterate. I mean, the huge element of literacy amongst freed slaves, amongst the slaves themselves. I mean, the coming of the Christian churches actually encourages literacy for all kinds of reasons. Reading the Bible. The Bible becomes important. And it becomes disruptive, because once you give people the ability to read something, they can read anything, And if they can write, even more. They don't have to stick to the Bible. So I think what was interesting about those letters, which are really extraordinarily moving, there's a terrific website called informationwanted.org, operated out of Villanova University. And they've been hoovering up this extraordinary volume of old ex-slaves, very old people, deep in old age, trying to make contact with lost loved ones. And the old lady in 1907, she wrote to the mayor, and the mayor contacted the local newspaper. And that's what happened. We have a number of letters to the mayor of Baltimore from old freed slaves saying, what happened to my family? These are the names. These are the people who owned them in particular towns. So literacy is built into it. Now, whether illiterate people then got someone else to write for them, I simply don't know. But literacy is much more commonplace and widespread than we might think.
And we'll take one more. This lady in the red. Right? No, go ahead.
This might sound a bit naive, but I'm looking here and it says 1500.
It says?
That this slave trade started in 1500.
Yes.
So somebody just one morning said, I think this is a good idea. How did this start?
Well, like all good ideas, they're pretty simple, aren't they? I mean, how did it start? Why? Well, I mean, why Africans? I mean, why would you turn to... If you think of it, this is a bizarre formula. The Europeans want to develop something in the Americas, and they turn to West Africa to ship them across, to produce a commodity, sugar, which they hadn't had before, and which came originally from the East. So... Well, there's an interesting story. I mean, what happens there is that, and again, there are people in this room that are better able to talk about this than me. What happens is that Spain and Portugal develop systems of slavery, not in Africa, not in the Americas, but in the islands off the coast of North Africa, of the Canaries, the Azores, and then in Sao Tome. The original gestation period takes place on that side of the Atlantic, not on this side of the Atlantic. And it's when they begin to settle in the Americas that they have to hand the use of Africans as labor for whatever developments they think appropriate, when there's a shortfall of local Indian labor, or not enough Europeans, or a mix of both. And what they had pioneered and perfected in the islands off Africa become the key to the development of the Americas. All right?
We'll call it a day there. Thank you all for coming and for your consistent support of our programs. Please join us outside for coffee, cookies and Prosecco. But most of all, please join me in thanking Jim Walvin for a masterclass in global history.
All right, okay. That was all right, was it? Okay.
Thank you.